The lock on my workshop door was scratched in a way it hadn't been the night before. Not broken, not forced, just tested. I noticed it before I noticed anything else, because for 35 years I made my living by noticing small deviations, metal fatigue, hairline cracks, stress where stress should not exist. Someone had tried my door. Inside, the lights were on. I never leave them on. The air smelled wrong, not oil or dust or steel filings. The smells I expect, but citrus cleaner. Sharp, artificial, the kind used to erase presence. My drafting table was cleared. Every blueprint I had been working on for the past month was stacked neatly in the corner, squared too perfectly. I don't square things perfectly. I align them by habit, not ceremony. The computer was on sleep mode. I hadn't touched it since the evening before. I didn't panic. I didn't call out. I walked the room slowly, counting steps without meaning to. That's an old habit from site inspections. Measure space before you react to it. Nothing was missing. That was what unsettled me. If someone breaks into a place and steals nothing, it means they were looking. Or checking. Or confirming something. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from my sister-in-law, Clara. Stopped by earlier. You left the side door open again. I locked it for you. Again. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. I don't leave doors open. Ever. Wind shear on coastal projects cured me of that habit decades ago. I typed back, "Which door?" Her reply came almost instantly. "The one you always forget about. Don't worry, we're just keeping an eye on things." I walked to the side door. The latch was engaged, but the bolt, my bolt, had been replaced. New metal, cheap, shiny, not something I would buy. Someone had changed hardware in my workshop without asking. I sat down on the stool by the workbench and listened to the building settle. The familiar creaks didn't calm me the way they usually did. This wasn't help. Help asks first. This was something else, and the most dangerous part was how casual it was. As if my space, my work, my habits had already been reclassified as communal. I took a photograph of the latch. Then another. Because when people start touching what isn't theirs and calling it concern, the only mistake you can make is assuming it will stop on its own. I am 69 years old. For most of my life, I worked as a structural engineer, bridges, industrial facilities, coastal infrastructure. Places where mistakes don't announce themselves loudly, where they wait quietly until someone ignores them long enough. That kind of work changes how you see the world. You stop trusting appearances. You pay attention to tolerances, not promises. When I retired, I didn't slow down so much as I narrowed my focus. I kept a small workshop behind my house, converted from an old storage building. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. I reviewed old designs, consulted occasionally, and built scale models to keep my hands steady and my mind sharp. My days were predictable in the way I preferred. Up at 6, coffee strong and plain, radio low, 3 hours in the workshop before lunch, a walk in the afternoon, dinner alone, usually something simple I could make without thinking. I didn't feel isolated. I felt contained. My wife, Evelyn, passed away 8 years ago. After that, I learned the value of quiet routines. No chaos, no surprises, no one rearranging your life with good intentions. Family contact was limited and deliberate. A phone call every Sunday with my brother, Mark. A holiday visit if schedules aligned. Nothing more. The only person who appeared more often was Mark's wife, Clara. She lived nearby and had a habit of checking in. She framed it as neighborly concern. I accepted it because, at the time, it cost me nothing. Or so I thought. Before recently, my life was defined by one simple rule. What was mine stayed mine. My work, my time, my decisions. I didn't ask for help. I didn't require supervision. And no one questioned my competence. Until they did. And when that shift begins, it doesn't start with accusations. It starts with smiles, spare keys, and someone saying, "I was just nearby." Clara did not arrive like an intruder. She arrived like a solution. After Evelyn died, The first year was quiet in a way that felt engineered. Every day the same angles, the same shadows, the same chair left empty at the table. I handled it the way I handled everything. Routine, discipline, minimal conversation. Mark called once a week. Clara started showing up. At first it was harmless. A casserole left on my porch. A bag of groceries I didn't ask for. She'd knock, smile, and say, I was already in the area. She said it the way people say, no trouble at all, as if proximity were permission. I let her in because it cost me nothing. Then I slipped on wet concrete behind the house one morning. Nothing broke, but my knee swelled and I had to sit on the back step for 10 minutes until the pain stopped arguing with gravity. Mark mentioned it on the phone, and by that afternoon Clara was at my door holding a little first aid kit like a prop. I'm not trying to control you, she said, placing it on the kitchen counter. I just want to know you're safe. Safe. People love that word because it sounds like care and functions like leverage. 2 days later she suggested a spare key, for emergencies. I said no. She didn't argue. She just smiled and said, of course, and waited. The key came anyway, not through a fight but through a small, clever weakness. A locksmith. My front door had started sticking in humid weather. I planned to oil the hinges and adjust the strike plate, but Clara insisted it would be easier to call someone. She scheduled the appointment while I was in the shower. When I came out, she said casually, he's on his way. The locksmith arrived, looked at the door, and did what locksmiths do. Clara stood next to him, asking questions, nodding, smiling. When he finished, she paid him with a card and asked him to cut one extra copy. I heard it. I didn't stop it. In that moment, I still believed the extra key would stay in a drawer somewhere and gather dust. It didn't. Once she had a key, she started using it as if it were a medical license. She began checking my pantry and throwing away food she called expired. She began rearranging my medicine cabinet, so you don't mix things up. She began answering questions I hadn't asked, and every time I pushed back, she looked offended in the same gentle, wounded way. I'm only helping, she'd say. Why are you making this difficult? The next access point was digital. I ordered parts for my models online, specialty fasteners, miniature bearings, drafting supplies. One afternoon my laptop wouldn't connect to the network. Clara offered to take a look. She asked for the Wi-Fi password and typed it in herself. Then she saved it. Then she connected her phone, just in case you need to hotspot later. A week after that, she told me she'd created an online folder to keep your important documents backed up. She said it like an act of kindness. Then she asked me to forward her a copy of my insurance card, my driver's license, just in case there's ever an emergency. I refused. She didn't argue. She just smiled and said, no problem, and kept coming over. Mark helped her more than she helped herself. He started calling with questions that didn't sound like his questions. Do you have your passwords written down anywhere? Did you update your beneficiaries? Have you considered simplifying accounts? He used the same tone every time, friendly, casual, slightly tired. The tone of a man repeating lines someone else wrote. That was how they gained access. Not by force, but by installing themselves into small gaps, repairs, errands, safety, organization, just in case. They made it seem rude to refuse. They made it sound responsible to comply. And once the key existed, physical and digital, Clara didn't have to ask again. She could simply show up and call it care. Pressure never announced itself as pressure. It arrived disguised as efficiency. Clara began by changing small things that did not belong to her. The thermostat, the placement of my tools, the order of objects on my workbench. Each time I noticed, she had an explanation ready. It's easier this way. You'll thank me later. I just made it safer. Safety became her favorite word. She used it the way engineers use load ratings, except without calculations, without limits, and without my consent. Mark started calling more often, but the calls were shorter. Less conversation, more checking. Had I eaten? Had I slept? Had I gone out alone? Each question stacked on the last until they formed an outline of a problem I did not have. When I objected, even mildly, the tone shifted. You're being defensive. We're worried. You don't have to prove anything. Those phrases were never spoken angrily. They were spoken patiently, which made them harder to push back against. Patience implies authority. It assumes the other person is delayed, not disagreeing. Clara began to arrive without knocking. Sometimes I heard the door open while I was in the workshop. Sometimes I didn't. She moved through the house quietly, as if silence itself were permission. When I asked her not to do that, she looked hurt. I have a key, she said. I thought that meant I was allowed. Allowed. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. My boundaries began to feel negotiable in their hands, not because I gave them up, but because every attempt to reinforce them was treated as evidence that they were necessary. Friends I used to see weekly stopped dropping by. Later I learned Clara had told them I was tired and didn't want visitors. Isolation is easiest when it looks like rest. Decisions began to happen without me. A doctor's appointment appeared on my calendar in Clara's handwriting. A brochure for a home safety assessment sat on the kitchen table. Mark mentioned casually that they were looking into options. Options for what? He didn't say. When I asked directly, Clara smiled. You don't need to worry about the details, she said. We're handling it. Handling it. I was still paying my bills. Still cooking my meals. Still thinking clearly. Yet somehow, I had become someone to be managed. The most unsettling part was not what they did. It was how confident they were doing it. Confidence like that doesn't come from concern. It comes from assumption. I didn't confront them, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have given them something they wanted. Reaction. Instead, I adjusted my behavior the way I always had on unstable sites. Reduce movement, increase observation. I began keeping a notebook in the workshop. Not hidden, not locked, plain. I wrote dates, times, descriptions in the neutral language I once used in inspection reports. June 14th. Clara entered house at 9:20 a.m. without knocking. Said she was checking on things. June 16th. Mark called, asked about finances. Same phrasing as previous call. Sounded rehearsed. June 18th. Note left on workbench. Be careful with the saw. No discussion beforehand. I didn't assign motives. I recorded actions. At night, I replayed conversations structurally. Who introduced the idea? Who reinforced it? Who concluded it? The pattern was consistent. Clara initiated concern. Mark validated it. Clara escalated. Mark framed it as consensus. They never argued with each other in front of me. Agreement had already been established elsewhere. I tested small boundaries. When Clara asked to take over paying one bill, to simplify things, I said I would handle it myself. She smiled. 2 days later, she brought it up again as concern. When Mark suggested I stop using certain tools, I thanked him for worrying and changed nothing. The next week Clara mentioned selling them. Before something happens. They were not listening to my answers. They were cataloging my resistance. That told me something important. Resistance was part of their narrative. So I stopped resisting, outwardly. I agreed to minor things that cost me nothing. I let them believe they were being effective. People who think they're winning become careless. And that's when the first real document showed up. It arrived as an email from my insurance provider. Subject line. Confirmation of authorized contact update. I read it once, then again. Your policy has been updated to include an authorized contact for scheduling, access coordination, and claim communications. Clara Henderson. Access coordination. That phrase is designed to sound harmless. It is not. When he arrived, I stood beside him the entire time. I watched the old hardware come off. I watched the new hardware go on. I paid in full and requested no additional keys be cut beyond the 2 in my hands. When he left, I photographed the serial numbers and stapled the receipt to my notebook. Then I handled digital access. I changed the Wi-Fi password, the router admin login, the recovery email tied to my accounts. I removed saved passwords from my laptop. I enabled two-factor authentication using a device Clara had never touched. It was tedious. It was also cleansing. Each change was a door closing. Narrative came next. Clara and Mark had been speaking as if my competence were optional. That kind of story spreads quietly and becomes common knowledge if you don't interrupt it with facts. So I created facts. I scheduled a routine appointment with my physician, an appointment I initiated, paid for, and attended alone. I told him, calmly, that relatives had begun making claims about my memory and attempting to schedule services on my behalf. I want one thing in my file, I said. Accurate documentation that I'm oriented, independent, and managing my affairs. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Understood, he said. And for the record, you're clearly competent. Put that in writing, I said, evenly. He did. Records came last, because records are where systems decide who is believed. I contacted my insurance provider again. I demanded the portal log, the timestamp, and the IP information attached to the change request. They wouldn't give me everything, but they gave me enough. The request originated from a device not associated with my account history. The confirmation went to Clara's email. The security questions were answered correctly, which meant someone had obtained them. That is not help. That is compromise. I called an attorney the next morning. Not a friend, not a family referral, a professional. I brought my notebook, the insurance email, the locksmith receipts, and a printed copy of the next steps list. He read everything without commentary. Then he asked one question. Has anyone been given authority, formally or informally, to act for you? No, I said. He nodded. Then we treat this as interference and unauthorized access, he said. And we do it clean. They tested the new limits within days. People who feel entitled always do. The first attempt came through Mark. He showed up on my porch on Thursday afternoon. Not knocking. Waiting. You didn't answer my email, he said as I approached. I read it, I replied. He followed me inside without asking. Old habits die hard. She's worried about you, he said. She thinks you're isolating yourself. She no longer has access, I said. That's exactly the problem, he replied. You're shutting people out. That doesn't look good. Not feel good. Look, I let him talk. He always did eventually. She spoke to someone, he continued. A professional. They said this kind of withdrawal can be a sign of decline. What professional? I asked. He hesitated. A consultant, he said. Someone who works with families. A non-answer. That evening, an email arrived from a home safety service I had never contacted. Thank you for your inquiry. Your assessment is scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. My address was correct. The contact number listed was Clara's. I canceled it in one sentence. I did not request this. No one is authorized to schedule services on my behalf. Within an hour, the service confirmed cancellation and offered to flag my file against third-party requests. I said yes. Clara texted me that night. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Need is what people say when they've lost leverage. I didn't reply. 5 minutes later, you're making things worse for yourself. Threat, stripped of decoration. Then came the mistake that mattered most. Mark forwarded me an email chain by accident. He meant to send it to Clara. He sent it to me. Subject line. Next steps if he won't cooperate. I read it twice. They discussed doctors, assessments, timing. Clara wrote that I was attached to risky behaviors. Mark wrote that I was in denial. One line stood out. If he won't agree voluntarily, we may need documentation first. Documentation. They weren't helping. Under the message was a phone number. Clara's phone number. My policy number was correct. My address was correct. The change date was yesterday afternoon. I hadn't made any change. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the screen until my coffee went cold. It wasn't the insurance company that bothered me. It was the direction. They weren't just checking in. They were positioning themselves as people who could speak for me to systems. Once systems believe that, the rest becomes easy. A service appointment, a safety assessment, a capacity check, a conversation with a doctor framed as routine. Then the story changes. Not because it's true, because it's official. I didn't call Clara. I called the insurance provider. I asked for the change request record, not a summary. The record. The representative hesitated, then said, "It was submitted online using the account portal. Verified through your security questions." My security questions, the ones Evelyn once joked were too practical to crack. I thanked the representative. Then I asked the next question. What email address received the confirmation? She read it out loud. It wasn't mine. It was an address I recognized as Clara's. That was the moment I stopped calling this family friction. This was interference. And interference, when it touches records, becomes fraud. The confrontation didn't happen with shouting. It happened with a small scene in the workshop. Monday, just after 9. I was adjusting a joint on a scale model when I heard Clara behind me. She hadn't knocked. I hadn't heard the door. She stood too close, watching my hands. "That tool is heavy," she said. "You shouldn't be using it alone." I set it down carefully. "I've used it for years," I replied. She sighed with practiced concern. "That's exactly the problem. You don't notice changes when they happen slowly." Then she reached past me and unplugged the tool. The action was casual, automatic, as if the decision had already been made and her body was simply executing it. I looked at the cord in her hand. "Please plug it back in," I said. She didn't. Instead, she smiled and handed me a folded sheet of paper. At the top, in neat handwriting, was a title. Next steps. Below it were bullet points. Reduce time in workshop. Limit use of power tools. Schedule full safety evaluation. Discuss long-term arrangements. Arrangements. I read the list twice. "This wasn't discussed," I said. Clara tilted her head the way she did when she wanted to appear patient. "We've talked about it many times," she replied. "You just don't like to hear it." That sentence did something precise and irreversible. It reframed disagreement as deficiency. Mark appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard him arrive either. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he said. Harder for whom? He didn't specify. I looked at them both. They weren't angry. They were confident. Confidence like that doesn't come from concern. It comes from rehearsed plans. I folded the paper once. Then I tore it cleanly down the middle. Clara inhaled sharply. Mark straightened. "This ends now," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You do not touch my equipment. You do not enter this space without permission. You do not make plans for my life." Clara's smile disappeared. "You're overreacting," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm responding appropriately." I walked past them, through the house, and opened the front door. "You should leave," I said. "Both of you." Mark hesitated. "We're just trying to help." "You're trying to control," I said. "And you're done." They left without drama. Clara looked offended. Mark looked confused. When the door closed, the house was quiet again. I stood there for a moment and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Certainty. I didn't celebrate. Relief is a luxury you earn after the last lever is removed. That afternoon I wrote 3 headings on a legal pad. Access, narrative, records. Then I treated my own life the way I used to treat compromised sites. Secure the perimeter first, then document the failure. Access came first. I called a locksmith myself. Not the one Clara knew. I asked for new deadbolts, new cylinders, and a reinforced strike plate. They were preparing justification. I printed the email chain and added it to my file. I didn't confront them with it. Confrontation would have alerted them to the error. I preferred them careless. The escalation happened quietly. I didn't threaten Clara or Mark. I moved past them into systems that do not care about intentions. Only records. My attorney sent 2 letters, one to Clara, one to Mark. Same tone, same content. They stated that neither party had permission to enter my property, schedule services, modify accounts, or represent my condition to third parties. Any further attempts would be documented as coercive interference and unauthorized access. The language was neutral, precise, unemotional. That matters. Then my attorney sent a third letter to my insurance provider, demanding restoration of my authorized contacts, a written record of the change request, and a notation that only my direct consent could authorize modifications. The insurance provider complied. They restored the account. They flagged it. They issued a formal note. Third-party authorization revoked. Verify identity by voice and in-person ID for changes. Clara lost a lever. She didn't like losing levers. 2 days later, she showed up at my door and knocked hard. When I didn't answer, she called through the door. "I know you're in there." Her voice wasn't concerned. It was offended. Neighbors heard. Curtains moved. Witnesses gathered. I opened the door just enough to say one sentence. "You are not welcome here. Please leave." Her face shifted. Not anger, disbelief. As if the rule had changed without her permission. "I'm trying to protect you," she snapped. I didn't argue. I closed the door. Concern, spoken quietly, can be denied later. Concern, shouted in public, becomes something else entirely. And Clara had just created witnesses. My attorney filed for a civil protective order the next morning. Not a dramatic restraining order, not a spectacle, but a court-recognized boundary against harassment and interference. He attached the evidence, the insurance authorization change email, the service appointment scheduled without consent, the email chain discussing documentation, the locksmith receipts and key control record, my dated notebook entries, a short statement from a neighbor about Clara's shouting at my door. The judge granted an interim order. No contact at my residence. No scheduling services in my name. No entering my property. No representing my condition. Mark received the notice and finally sounded like a man hearing consequences for the first time. "This is insane," he said on a voicemail. I didn't answer. Clara sent one last message. "You're isolating yourself. This path leads nowhere." I saved it. Then I blocked her number. Because boundaries are not arguments. They are decisions. They tried to soften it. Not with accountability. With optics. Mark left a careful voicemail late one evening. "We've all had time to cool down," he said. "Clara feels terrible about how things escalated. She never wanted conflict. Conflict is a word people use to pretend both sides pushed equally. Maybe we should sit down," he continued. "Family shouldn't need lawyers." He didn't mention the insurance change. He didn't mention the scheduled assessment. He didn't mention the email chain. That's how you know it's not remorse. It's repositioning. Clara tried a different angle. A handwritten letter. Rounded handwriting. Soft language. Missing details. She wrote that she overstepped, and that paperwork made things feel cold. She asked to reset. Reset. That word appears when leverage is gone. I placed the letter in my file and said nothing. Then came the pressure through others. A cousin called to say she'd heard I was going through a hard adjustment. A former colleague asked whether I was overwhelmed lately. I corrected each conversation the same way. "I'm well." There was interference. It's been addressed. No elaboration. No emotion. No opening. When Mark emailed again proposing mediation, I replied with one sentence. "There is nothing to mediate." That ended it. After that, the messages stopped. Not because they understood, because they recognized the limits were real. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was deliberate. For the first time in months, my days were shaped only by my own decisions. No unexpected entries. No messages framed as concern. No assumptions disguised as care. Silence returned to its proper function, not absence, but space. I did not rush to fill it. I reorganized the workshop slowly. Not because it had been disturbed, but because reclaiming space is a physical act. I replaced the latch with one I trusted. I filed my blueprints the way I preferred. I cleaned my tools with oil, not citrus cleaner. I informed the people who mattered, and no one else. My physician received a brief update confirming that family involvement was revoked unless explicitly authorized. My attorney finalized the order and closed the file. Service providers flagged my accounts. No drama. No speeches. Control is quiet when it is legitimate. I saw Mark once, by accident, at a grocery store. We stood in the same aisle for a moment, pretending to examine labels. He nodded. I nodded back. Nothing more was said. That was enough. Clara never contacted me again. Not because she accepted the boundary. Because she understood it. There's a difference. One is emotional. The other is structural. I did not feel victorious. Victory implies a contest. This had been a correction. I learned something I should have known earlier. Boundaries are not punishments. They are filters. They do not exist to keep people out. They exist to determine who is allowed in. My life became smaller in number and larger in clarity. Fewer voices, cleaner lines, no ambiguity about who speaks for me. I still hear the word safe sometimes, used in passing by others. I understand now what it often means. Controlled, predictable, convenient. I am none of those things. I am capable. I am attentive. I am responsible for myself. That is the order I return to. Not the one imposed on me. The one I chose. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.